demonstration, ICE has ramped up enforcement, including a record-breaking 2,200 people arrested on June 4th. This is still apparently not enough for White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, who has proclaimed that ICE must now arrest 3,000 people per day. And we've covered ICE's questionable tactics, but it's worth noting that many of these immigrants are being arrested when they're actually trying to comply with the law by adhering to immigration appointments. As we've talked about, some of them were being shuttled around in various detention centers around the country. Others were being shipped off to Salvadoran torture prison or South Sudan with little or no due process. And partially in response to these hardline tactics, protests broke out last week in Los Angeles. And now, inflaming an already inflammatory situation, the federal government has sent in the National Guard and, most alarmingly, the Marines. And the legality of using the military domestically is dubious at best. How did we get here? Well, ICE had staged a series of raids around the city on the morning of June 6th, targeting a Home Depot, places where day laborers look for work. Now, we've already covered this in depth in a video that we just recently released, so we're only going to provide a cursory summary here. According to later statements by Governor Gavin Newsom's office, these raids were done without notifying law enforcement. And on the afternoon of June 6th, David Huerta, the president of the California Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, the state's largest union, was accosted by law enforcement and arrested while protesting. Later that afternoon, demonstrators gathered outside of the LA Detention Center where Huerta and others were being held. The LAPD declared an unlawful assembly and deployed tear gas on the protesters. The next morning, when news of the raid at another Home Depot in a Latino-majority neighborhood spread on social media, a few hundred protesters gathered nearby. Law enforcement fired tear gas as protesters threw rocks and objects at law enforcement vehicles and tried to set up a makeshift roadblock. Later that evening, protesters gathered in Compton, where some protesters lit fire to damaged vehicles and threw stones at law enforcement. And in response that night, the city instituted a curfew. According to news media reports and statements by both Mayor Karen Bass and Governor Newsom, the protests were largely peaceful, with only isolated incidents of violence and vandalism. Nevertheless, at 7 p.m. on June 7th, the Trump administration bypassed Governor Newsom and announced that it would deploy the National Guard, claiming the protests were a, quote, rebellion against the United States. This marked the first time a U.S. president has mobilized military forces domestically without the request of the state's governor since 1965. At the same time, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth also announced that 500 Marines at Camp Pendleton in California had been placed on high alert. Newsom immediately denounced the deployment of military troops, calling it illegal, immoral, and unconstitutional, and threatened to take legal action.
Well, I mean, look, Donald Trump has created the conditions you see on your TV tonight. He's exacerbated the conditions. He's, lit the proverbial match. He's putting fuel on this fire ever since he announced he was taking over the National Guard. An illegal act, an immoral act, an unconstitutional act.
But the Trump administration ignored the governor's objections and deployed around 300 National Guard members to the streets of Los Angeles on the morning of Sunday, June 8th. Governor Newsom's predictions were accurate, and the deployment of the troops seemed to escalate the situation. Thousands of protesters amassed in downtown LA. There were reports of vehicles set on fire, and law enforcement officers firing projectiles, tear gas, and pepper balls at journalists and protesters. A few hundred protesters blocked Highway 101, and as tensions escalated, Mayor Bass and Governor Newsom both urged protesters to stand down and remain peaceful. By Monday, June 8th, the protesters appeared to calm, but ICE doubled down and raided several Home Depot locations across the LA metropolitan area. By Monday afternoon, Governor Newsom made good on his threat to sue the administration, and the state of California filed suit in federal court, arguing that President Trump had overstepped his authority and violated the sovereignty of the state of California and the Constitution. California asked Judge Charles Breyer of the Northern District of California to grant a temporary restraining order by Tuesday at 1 p.m., barring federal troops from engaging in civilian law enforcement in LA. Judge Breyer declined to issue a temporary restraining order by 1 p.m. on June 10th, and instead the judge gave the parties an opportunity to more fully brief the matter. The hearing on Thursday, June 12th at 1:30 p.m.
We'll see this guy's finished last.
June 13th through the 23rd. Shop the sale online or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store. On Tuesday afternoon, despite the apparent lull in the protests, and despite California's lawsuit demanding that the Trump administration withdraw the troops, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth posted on Twitter that, quote, approximately 700 active-duty U.S. Marines from Camp Pendleton are being deployed to Los Angeles. The Associated Press reported that these troops would join the approximately 2,100 National Guard troops that were already on the ground there. And President Trump boasted on Truth Social about the deployment of the military, including the Marines to LA, but declined to set a concrete timetable for when the troops would leave LA. National Guard in California.
That's what you get when you play with dolls.
It's common sense. You ask me that question, but there's no danger now.
Only specifying that, quote, when there's no danger, they'll be an official testified before Congress. The estimated cost of deploying all of these troops to LA would be roughly $134 million. So it means that those struggling to articulate to Congress what authority the Department of Defense was using to justify this deployment.
It's about maintaining law and order on behalf of law enforcement. It's their job without being attacked by mobs and people. We're very proud that the National
You're
Guard
mine,
are on the
shit
streets
for brains.
defending I speak to T4 and
Motherfuckers!
There's plenty of precedent for U.S. countries and plus your military is very now is laying Constantino wire. I think but also diminution of the readiness and the focus of the military.
At least I already covered on this channel the legal issues related to the deployment of the National Guard in the video that we just released. The other section summary, Section 12, Form 6 allows the President to federalize the National Guard in certain limited circumstances. Ensuring state militias is sole command of the federal government, command of the states. And as Liz talked about, for circumstances when state militias can be federalized, the second circumstance is in case of rebellion, and it doesn't seem like any of those appear to be relevant right now. But if you want a more comprehensive overview of the law with respect to the National Guard, we'll put a link down to the description to the video we just released. Right now, I want to focus on the deployment of the Marines, because that is a completely separate matter. The use of the state military to enforce civilian laws is generally prohibited under the Constitution Act. And because of the danger of military-civilian conflict, protections against military engagement with civilians are actually made right into our Constitution. Abuses committed by the British Army against American colonist civilians were part of what led the founders to divide the military power between Congress and the President and to draft the guarantees in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. The Posse Comitatus Act of 18 U.S.C. 1385 states that, quote, whoever except in cases under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or enacted of Congress willfully uses any part of the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, or the Space Force as Posse Comitatus or otherwise substitute clause shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both. Now, notably, the Coast Guard is not considered part of the military for the purposes of the Posse Comitatus Act, which unfortunately lends fodder for those that claims that the Belt Pirates are real military. I'm sorry for the Coastie erasure. But the law allows for immigration related exemptions in Congress created for the Insurrection Act, which we'll talk more about in a second. Congress can also create exceptions for a variety of other specific scenarios, including some drug enforcement operations and domestic bombings. But over the years, Congress has also carved out some specific activities the military can participate in that don't violate the Posse Comitatus Act. Those include maintenance of air transportation, training, and surveillance support, and the provision of action and information in some circumstances. 10 U.S.C. 271, for instance, allows the military to, quote, provide to federal, state, or local civilian law enforcement officials any information collected during the military training or operations that may be provided to the federal or state law and jurisdictions of such officials. Section 272 allows the Secretary of Defense to, quote, make available any equipment, associated supplies, or charts in this facility, research facility of the Department of Defense to the federal, state, civilian law enforcement official or law enforcement purposes. These sections all describe indirect support functions, not direct participation in civilian law enforcement. And federal regulations echo this distinction, prohibiting, quote, direct participation by a member of the Army, Navy, Air Force, or Marine Corps in a search, seizure, arrest, or other similar activity, unless participation in such activity by such member is otherwise authorized by law. And in opposition to the state of California's motions for temporary restraining order, the Trump administration claimed that, quote, plaintiff's objection based on the Posse Comitatus Act is equally misguided. Neither the National Guard nor the Marines are engaged in law enforcement. Rather, they are protecting law enforcement consistent with long-standing practice and the inherent protective power to provide for the safety of federal property and personnel. Now, if indeed the military's activities lead to protecting other law enforcement personnel and property, then
Where did you go? I just want to play.
fires in the circuit. Yeah. Should be insisted on this.
Man, the good guy wins.
It's really scary.
Run, dipshit.
That's it's a very common approach. She's
Aiming high.
It's time for us to get
All
this message.
through the end. Let's go.
We actually figured out that we were gonna get into a routing system.
The military's activities were limited to protecting other law enforcement personnel. Pictures in ICE's own Twitter posts certainly make corporate military troops in LA are directly participating in a wide variety of civilian law enforcement activities. And according to the state of California's motion for reform,
Something for ya.
a secure perimeter in communities around areas where immigration enforcement activities would take place, and securing routes over public streets where immigration enforcement officers would try to DOD regulations explicitly prohibiting members of the military from engaging in seizure or arrests. The commander overseeing U.S. military operations in Los Angeles has also claimed that troops deployed to the city have the authority to temporarily detain civilians. As we'll talk about, not only does the Constitution still apply to state police officers, but it also applies to federal agents and members of the military. There's this thing as a temporary detention of civilians. If you're not free to go, that's called an arrest. And if this is true, that kind of direct involvement by the military would force the freedom of danger to civilians. As the state of California pointed out in its court filing, when military troops participate in these kinds of law enforcement activities, it greatly increases the chance of well-armed troops with weapons of war who will have physical confrontations with civilians. This creates an especially dangerous situation because military troops, unlike regular law enforcement, or at least some of them, are trained to kill enemies, not necessarily to de-escalate or temporarily illustrate these being civilians. This was infamously illustrated in the Kent State shootings. On May 4, 1970, during protests related to the Vietnam War, National Guard soldiers fired about 6 to 7 rounds over 13 seconds, killing 4 Kent State University students, wounding 9 others, and one of whom suffered permanent paralysis. Support for military use and civilian protesters in LA is coming straight from the president. According to former Defense Secretary Mark Esper, during the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, President Trump inquired about whether the National Guard could shoot protesters in the legs. Former Secretary Esper reportedly objected to that possibility. Current Secretary Pete Hegseth refused to answer what should have been a really easy question.
In June of 2020, then President Trump directed former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper to shoot protesters in the legs in downtown D.C. Secretary Esper refused to from President Trump.
Senator, I was in the Washington, D.C. National Guard unit, was in Lafayette Square during the legitimate negotiation of protesters
in the legs.
saw 50 students get injured by riders trying to jump over the fence, set the church on fire, destroy
It was
the
supposed to be that you were
such an and President Trump's public statements made it appear likely that Secretary Hegseth will eventually be faced with that kind of scenario. In a recent Truth Social post about LA protesters, President Trump said, quote, "If they spit, we will hit. And I promise you they will be hit harder than they've ever been hit before. Such disrespect is program." And here's the part where I remind you that disrespect is First Amendment to activity. Referring to the LA protesters as animals and for enemies, and President Avery repeated the baseless conspiracy theory that Governor Newsom and Mayor Passage funded the protesting. In Los Angeles, the governor of California, the mayor of Los Angeles, they're incompetent and they paid traffickers, educators, and insurrectionists.
Oh!